For decades, schools across our nation have used the letter grade system along with standardized tests to measure and monitor students' academic careers. Recently, educators and school administrations have begun to discuss whether the system is effective or if an alternative method should be considered. Some argue that although the current letter grade system may not be perfect, it succeeds in serving its purpose. Standardized tests similarly test students in an accurate way that ensures that they are ready to graduate. Additionally, they say these methods have been used for decades, and implementing a new method would present far too many obstacles. However, others say that this system is outdated and unfair. They suggest that students already have so many obligations and responsibilities to juggle, like family, friends, and other activities. The pressure of a bad grade only capitalizes on this stress. The article, Will Eliminating the F Eliminate Bad School Design, also discusses how students simply don't have enough time to learn the material. According to educator Sal Khan, we are telling students they've learned something that they really haven't learned. In order to learn more about this topic, we did some research on the current grading system and some alternative options, such as standard-based learning. We also interviewed individuals to gather their points of view on this issue. Some were educators and experts on the matter, while others were ordinary students, just like us.
A Washington article stated that they're moving toward not using an F to keep students motivated. Their idea is a grade based largely on instructional hours spent in class. Many teachers have to move on from lessons whether students know the materials or not. By the time students are 18, less than half are college ready. Even getting a 70% on a test, they should still learn the materials, but instead the teacher moves on. By doing this, it makes the students unprepared for colleges. Test scores do not reflect students' individual process. Teachers focus on test scores to measure performance without consideration to other significant factors that affect a student's ability to learn. Studies show that the grading system is deficient and is not an accurate reflection of students' progress. Assigning C's, D's, and F's labels the students as underperforming, making them lose motivation to try hard in school. Research shows exams do not reflect academic achievement in students, and standardizing tests don't accurately measure skills students need to succeed after high school.
Good.
Good?
Do you want to be in it or no?
I don't.
Okay, then I'll.
Neither do I, but I have to be.
Okay.
No, you promised not to make me look like an idiot, right?
We promise.
I'll do my
100%.
best.
Alrighty, is it going?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we should just start with what grading models does our school specifically use in Cheyenne?
Sure. So that's an interesting question because right now, basically our grading models have been around for about 100 years. We have long used, especially at the secondary level, a system that uses A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. That system has long been used to sort students out, generally for the sake of trying to place them into colleges. There is a new shift, however, in education that has taken footing at a lot stronger in the elementary schools, and that's a standards-based grading approach. That looks at proficiency scales on specific skills rather than just looking at sorting students. Grades themselves are very, very complicated. I often give the example of a student who is perhaps in a math class, and they're trying to learn a skill sequentially. So student A goes from a 60% to a 70% to an 80% to a 90% to a 100%. Now, in a general system, the way the system typically works, a teacher would probably average out those 5, and the student gets a 75%. But on a proficiency scale, that student didn't know it at the beginning and has mastered it at the end. On a proficiency scale, that student should be getting an A. They have now learned it. It may have taken them a little bit longer, and maybe they started at a lower point. Conversely, let's look at student B. They started at 100. They knew the information they needed to go into the unit, but now the student went from a 100 to a 90 to an 80 to a 70 to a 60 on the summative. Those same two students in the traditional model will average a 75%. They are getting the same grade. But student A knows the material, and student B has not mastered the material. And unfortunately, in a system like we have right now, we can only give them one grade. And that seems to be a big, big problem with how we're trying to figure out what students actually know and are able to do. So that's a system we've been dealt. Elementaries are now starting to say, let's give them proficiency scores on skills. So if you're in an English class, we're going to measure your reading score. We're going to measure your writing score. We're going to measure your discussion ability. And those are actually going to get different proficiency marks, rather than trying to group them all together and say, you just get an A in English, which can be very, very confusing because it just doesn't report out very cleanly.
Right. So what obstacles are there in place for changing the current letter grade system?
Yeah, so that's a really complicated one. When you talk to teachers, one of the primary concerns with changing our system is that grades are perceived as a motivating factor, that grades motivate students to perform well. What research actually says, however, is that grades seem to only motivate kids at the top. They don't do a whole lot for kids who are not getting very good grades. In fact, sometimes it can go the other direction and have a negative correlation. Students sometimes are less likely to perform well if they know they're getting a grade on it, particularly those kids that are not performing well. So one of the big obstacles is, how do we motivate students to perform if we don't give them some sort of carrot at the end? That's a big problem, because we don't own your car, we don't own your cell phone, we don't own your video games. The only thing that a teacher really has control over is a grade. If you take that away from the teacher, and I simply say, okay, tomorrow you have a paper due, or you need to do assignment 12.1, and there's no grade attached to it, the fear is the student won't do anything because there are no consequences. So the law of natural consequences for teachers is, at least I can hold them accountable to a grade, otherwise they won't do any work. What's interesting, and I often give this analogy to students, is there is already a motivating factor in schools. You have it innately as a child. When you're in a kindergarten and first grade class, and a teacher asks a question, immediately 30 hands go like this, and they're going crazy, because in your DNA, you love to learn. People love learning. But what's interesting about incentives is that as soon as you switch the incentive and you say, what used to be a desire to learn, let's replace that with a desire to get a grade, then the desire to learn has actually been lessened. And students are willing then to just jump through the hoops to get the carrot. The interesting thing, and the real big problem that we're faced with, is standardized or standards-based grading removes the carrot and says, let's focus on your love of learning. Let's give you feedback on how to acquire that knowledge and skill. But when you take the carrot away, for the students that have had the carrot initially, we find out that they've lost that motivation. So it really only works if we never insert the grades ever to a student. So that's a big problem.
Yeah.
Another big problem, one more big one, is that there is also this belief that our job, in part, is to provide data and information to post-secondary colleges regarding how well our students are performing. And we expect to provide them with a grade, some sort of sorting mechanism that says how a student is performing compared to other students, compared to other schools. And so that methodology makes us kind of in this traditional mindset, because we think colleges are going to require it. And because we want students to be college ready and be able to go to college, we feel like we need to sometimes keep that old model in place.
Right. So kind of getting into the more looking into college, do you think that letter grades and test scores play too big of a role in getting into college? And like college admissions, and you know, they look for so many different aspects of life. Like they look for sports and like volunteer hours and activities and groups, just being in all different aspects of the school, like with those test scores and grades. Like, do you think it plays too big of a role, or is there like any other way to?
Sure. So yeah, one of the great ironies of college admission, and colleges now recognize the irony of this, is that your GPA has very, very little proven evidence to correlate to your success in college. Students who have high GPAs, predictably, we would assume are going to perform well in college, but that's not actually what the evidence says. Your ACT score also does not have strong evidence for how well you will perform in college. Your AP classes also do not have a strong indication of how you're going to perform in college. So it's really interesting because we put a ton of emphasis on that, and colleges traditionally had done that. But they actually have the data now, and they don't do that as frequently. They are starting to now look at a more complete way to look at a student, their involvement. The interesting thing is the data that actually has the strongest correlation to college readiness and success is not any of those factors, your GPA, your ACT, your AP. It's actually your willingness to take an AP exam. So what's interesting is college success, what they've identified it now as, is that it has a lot more to do with the terms grit and resilience. Your willingness to face something really hard and do it anyway. That seems to be the strongest indicator of college success. So, in terms of colleges, they started to say, we are not going to put emphasis on GPAs anymore. We're not going to think of that as a really important facet of how we will admit students. The other element, which is totally understandable to a high school student, is this. Teacher A and teacher B are teaching the same class, and an A in one class does not mean an A in another class. There is a lot of variability in how teachers grade. And you take that outside of the schools, school A and school B, and teacher A from school A and teacher B from school B have a ton of variability. An A in one class and an A in another class are not very similar, oftentimes, when we look at it. And so colleges said, I can't trust what your grades even mean, because this school and this school and this teacher just do not do it the same way.
So looking at it that way, how do they determine who should be admitted into their college then, if you're not looking at like statistics, what they do, like their grading, like their test scores? How do you determine that they have like grit and resilience?
Yeah, so that is interesting. We have not been able to figure a lot of that out. Colleges are doing their very best to try to do more of that information. They do a lot more with interviews. They try to use several data points, which might include GPA, extracurriculars, ACT scores, AP exams. All of those might fit in. But in terms of how we measure grit and resilience, we have not been able to effectively do that so far. So we know it's important, more important than grades, but culturally, it is really, really hard to convince students, parents, colleges, how we can measure that and why that might matter more, because we are so ingrained in this idea that the most important thing is the grade. And it just turns out that that's really not true.
So kind of taking it back to like learning the material as opposed to just memorizing it for the test, and looking at the fact that students learn in different ways, are there ways to adapt to different styles of learning? And like, does that play a role in tests? Because some students learn things better when they're up and moving around, and some listen, like when they listen to a lecture, they learn better. Like, does that have any role in test taking or in just learning the material?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, how accurate is the test? And you probably recognize that when it comes to most tests, particularly like multiple choice, fill in the blank, true and false, those have a tendency to measure lower level skills and often don't include some of the soft skills that employers really want to see. Can you communicate? Can you work with others? Are you willing to meet deadlines? Those are really important things to an employer, and a multiple choice test probably can't do that. And so there is this idea that we need to shift away from these more traditional assessment models like the ones you're talking about and move toward giving students the ability to authentically assess their own learning. What can I do? What skill do I have? And what are the myriad of ways in which I can share that with you? So instead of looking at this kind of traditional Scantron style type of test, what is the best way for me individually to express what I know and am able to do in my own unique way? That type of authentic assessment is, we know it works, but it is a big challenge for teachers to create assessments like that and then to ultimately have the time to grade them. Because the most efficient models that we have are the ones where we can immediately put it through a Scantron and know your score. You do that model versus, let's say, for example, doing some sort of performance where they have to use a rubric or they have to, that might be a written performance, a verbal performance, something like that. That takes a lot longer to grade. And teachers, like all employees, have limited scope in terms of time. And so you have to make tough choices sometimes.
And so I know that this is going to kind of sound a little harsh, but is that also with teachers wanting to be kind of done with grading quick and stuff like that? And you talked about grit and resilience and taking the time to like learn and sit down and work hard to get to learn the material. That's what colleges are looking for. Is that kind of like the same thing for teachers, that like if they want to provide their students with this new idea of testing, are they going to have that grit and resilience as well? Well,
that's true. I think one of the things that is important to remember is that the assessment types that I'm talking about it's not that they're useless. I kind of give the analogy of walking into a doctor's office. You walk into a doctor's office, and if you didn't have any blood work done or any conversation with the doctor about your symptoms, you just simply walked in and they gave you a pill, and you didn't even tell them what was wrong with you, you would feel like that doctor has done you a great disservice. One of the jobs of teachers is to diagnose what the student knows. We need to do that very, very quickly. Just like they might take your blood pressure when you come into the doctor. That might not be the only type of assessment that we do, but we need that information. So sometimes you'll have a lot of summative tests that are big picture, and you'll have even more tests or assessments that are small picture called formative assessments. And those formative assessments are ways that we do diagnosis. We need to know what you know or don't know. If you already know it, let's move on. If you don't know it, we need to find a way to intervene for you, whether that's individually or if a whole class doesn't know it, we're going to intervene as a class. So we are trying to pull data as quickly as possible because we know the best way to give students feedback is quickly. And the best ways that we have for quick assessments are just like doctors. What can you do that I can turn it around very, very quickly? That it won't be the only type of test that we have, but we need to turn around and get as much information as quickly as possible so we can make the decisions on how to move forward.
All right, so I guess my final question is, overall, do you think tests are beneficial to students?
Yeah, I think they're inevitable in the sense that we need to measure what a student knows and is able to do. The term test might be kind of a traditional word, but ultimately, I think the new vernacular is assessment. I think we look at tests as kind of these old, staple it in the corner, A, B, C, D kinds of things. But students need to know for themselves, how are they doing? And the teacher needs to know, how are they doing? You need to assess students. You can't just, sit up in the front of the room and talk and never find out what a student can know or be able to do. Tests are invaluable in helping people grow in their own education and helping teachers make decisions on how they can enable that growth. So it's absolutely fundamental to education. We're just still in the process of trying to figure out how to get it right. We're not quite there yet.
All right. Well, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Did I give you some decent